welcome back to Naptime Knowledge. Take a long, slow breath in and out. Let your chest rise and fall. Let the tension you have been carrying in your shoulders, in your jaw, behind your eyes, release just a little with each exhale. There is nowhere to be tonight. There's nothing left to do. The day is finished, and all that remains now is rest. Breathe in and breathe out. Tonight, we are going on a journey. Not far in space. We are staying right here on Earth, on the very continent many of us already call home or have visited. But we are going very far in time. We are traveling back approximately 2,500 years to a small settlement on 7 hills beside a slow river in central Italy. We are going to Rome. Rome is one of those subjects that seems almost too large to approach. It lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. At its height, it governed a territory stretching from the Scottish border in the north to the sands of the Sahara in the south, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal in the west to the banks of the Euphrates in the east. It gave the world its legal foundations, its architectural vocabulary, its calendar, its languages. Latin is the mother of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and the grandmother of much of English. It gave the world Christianity as a world religion, carrying it from a small province in the Middle East to every corner of the known world. And it gave the world the idea of the city itself, the idea that human beings could live together in numbers previously unimaginable in an organized and governed urban space. But Rome was also, always, a place of ordinary human life, of markets and bakeries and crowded streets, of parents worrying about their children and neighbors arguing about property lines, and young people falling in love in the shadow of monuments so large they still awe us 2,000 years later. It was a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty, of high philosophy and low comedy, of gods and gladiators and senators and slaves. Take a breath now. Let your body settle. We will explore all of it tonight, slowly and gently, chapter by chapter, letting Rome unfold around us like a city seen from a slow boat on a river. Sleep will find you somewhere along the way. And when it does, let it come. Rome will wait. Rome has always waited. It is, after all, the eternal city. Chapter 1. The Founding Myths. Romulus, Remus, and the She-Wolf. Every great civilization has its founding story, the myth that explains not just where it came from, but what it is, what it stands for, what kind of people its citizens are meant to be. Rome's founding story is one of the most vivid and strange and revealing in all of human mythology, and it has never lost its power to fascinate. According to Roman tradition, the city was founded in 753 BCE by a man named Romulus. But the story of Romulus begins much earlier, with a tale of divine descent, political intrigue, and miraculous survival that sets the tone for everything Rome would become. Long before Rome, there was a city called Alba Longa, said to have been founded by Aeneas, a Trojan prince who fled the destruction of Troy and sailed west to Italy, carrying his household gods and his destiny with him. The Romans loved this connection to Troy, and the poet Virgil would later write the Aeneid, an epic poem tracing the founding of Rome back to the fall of that ancient city, giving Rome a mythological pedigree that stretched back to the gods themselves. In Alba Longa, many generations after Aeneas, there ruled a king named Numitor. His brother Romulus, ambitious and ruthless, overthrew him, seized the throne, killed Numitor's sons, and forced Numitor's daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to chastity, so that she couldn't produce heirs who might one day challenge his rule. But the gods had other plans. Mars, the god of war, came to Rhea Silvia, and she conceived twin sons. When Romulus discovered this, he had Rhea Silvia imprisoned and ordered the twins thrown into the Tiber River to drown. His servants placed the infants in a basket and set them in the river. But instead of drowning them, the river carried the basket gently to the base of the Palatine Hill, one of Rome's 7 hills, and set it down on the bank. Breathe slowly, in and out. There, a she-wolf found the infants, and instead of eating them, which would have been the natural thing for a wolf to do, she nursed them. She suckled Romulus and Remus as if they were her own cubs, keeping them warm and fed until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and took them home to raise as his own sons. This image, the twins beneath the she-wolf, nursing at her teats, became one of the most enduring symbols in all of human history. The bronze statue of the Capitoline wolf, a she-wolf with 2 small human figures beneath her, has been copied and reproduced and referenced in art and culture for 2,500 years. It represents something essential about the Roman self-image. Rome was nurtured by something fierce and wild. Rome's greatness came not from gentle origins, but from something untamed, something dangerous, something that should by rights have destroyed it, but instead gave it life. Romulus and Remus grew up strong and bold. They eventually discovered their true identity, killed Romulus, restored their grandfather Numitor to his throne in Alba Longa, and then set out to found a city of their own. They chose the 7 hills beside the Tiber, the site where they had been suckled by the wolf, the place where their destiny had been preserved. But there was a quarrel. Both brothers wanted to be the city's founder, its first king, the one whose name it would bear. They agreed to settle the dispute by augury, by observing the flight of birds, a traditional Roman method of divining the will of the gods. Remus, standing on the Aventine Hill, saw 6 vultures. Romulus, standing on the Palatine Hill, saw 12. Romulus declared himself the winner. Remus was not satisfied. He mocked his brother's work, jumping over the low walls Romulus was building as a symbol of contempt. And Romulus killed him, his own twin brother, the companion of his miraculous survival, the partner of his whole life, killed for the symbolic act of leaping over a wall. This too is revealing. Rome's founding is stained with fratricide. The eternal city was born in violence, in a brother's blood, in the assertion of power over kinship. The Romans did not hide this or sanitize it. They told the story in full, generation after generation, and in some ways they seemed to consider it a source of strength rather than shame. A reminder that Rome's greatness had been paid for from the very beginning with sacrifice. Romulus became Rome's first king, He is said to have ruled for many years, building the city, establishing its laws, populating it by offering asylum to outcasts and fugitives from surrounding peoples, solving the shortage of women by the famous rape of the Sabine women, a mass abduction of women from the neighboring Sabine tribe that led to war, and then to reconciliation, and eventually to the merging of the Roman and Sabine peoples into a single community. At the end of his reign, according to the myth, Romulus did not die. He was taken up into the sky during a thunderstorm, carried away by the gods, and became a deity himself, worshipped afterward as the god Quirinus. Rome's founder was also Rome's first god. The city had been there from the beginning, it seemed, in the mind of the divine. Breathe in slowly and let it go. Let the image of the 7 hills settle into your mind, the Tiber winding through them, the she-wolf watching from the shadows, the first stones of the first walls being laid in the golden Italian afternoon. Rome is beginning. It will take a very long time to finish. Chapter 2. The Roman Republic. When Rome learned to govern itself. After the mythological kings came the historical ones. 7 kings in the Roman tradition, ruling from the founding until 509 BCE, when the last of them, a tyrant named Tarquinius Superbus, was overthrown in a revolution, and Rome declared itself a republic. It was one of the most consequential political transformations in human history. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing, the common matter, the affairs of the people. In place of a king, Rome would be governed by elected magistrates, serving limited terms, accountable to the Senate and to the people. No single person would hold supreme power. Power would be divided, balanced, checked by other power. This principle, the principle that no individual should be too powerful, that authority should be distributed and limited, became one of the most influential ideas in the history of political thought. Take a slow breath. Feel yourself sinking deeper into rest. The Roman Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense. It was an oligarchy, a government dominated by a relatively small class of wealthy aristocratic families called the patricians. But it had democratic elements, and over the centuries of the Republic's existence, those elements grew stronger as the common people, the plebeians, fought, generation after generation, for a larger share of political power. At the head of the Republican government were 2 consuls, elected annually, who shared executive power. The genius of the dual consulship was the mutual veto. Each consul could block the actions of the other, preventing either from acting tyrannically. In times of genuine emergency, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single individual with supreme power, but only for a maximum of 6 months, and only to deal with the specific crisis at hand. The Romans were acutely aware of the dangers of concentrated power. They had been ruled by kings, and they had not liked it, and the constitution of the Republic was designed at every level to prevent its return. The Senate was the heart of the Republican system. It was an assembly of several hundred men, former magistrates, heads of patrician families, the accumulated experience and authority of Roman aristocratic life. The Senate did not pass laws. That was the function of the popular assemblies. But it debated and advised on matters of foreign policy, finance, and administration, and its advice, the Senatus Consultum, the Council of the Senate, was in practice very difficult for magistrates to ignore. The debates in the Senate were famous for their quality and their passion. Roman senators were trained in rhetoric, the art of public speaking, from childhood, and the best of them were orators of extraordinary power. Cicero, who lived in the 1st century BCE, and whose speeches and letters have survived to give us the most vivid picture we have of late Republican Rome, was perhaps the greatest orator the ancient world produced. His speeches against the corrupt governor Verres, against the conspirator Catiline, against Mark Antony, they were performances as much as arguments, carefully crafted works of verbal art designed to persuade, to move, to overwhelm. But the Republic was always tense with conflict, between patricians and plebeians, between the Senate and the popular assemblies, between the old aristocratic families and the new men who rose to power through military brilliance or commercial success. Over the centuries, these tensions produced reforms. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code, established around 450 BCE. The Licinian Sextian laws of 367 BCE, which opened the consulship to plebeians for the first time. The Lex Hortensia of 287 BCE, which gave the decisions of the plebeian assembly the force of law binding on all Romans. Slowly, imperfectly, with much resistance and many reversals, the Roman Republic became more inclusive. The plebeians gained political rights. The Italian allies of Rome gained citizenship. The Republic expanded and changed and adapted. And for 5 centuries it governed what would become the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. And then it destroyed itself. The very success of the Republic, the vast wealth and power that conquest brought, created pressures that its constitutional structures could not contain. Military commanders became too powerful. The gap between rich and poor became too wide. The violence of politics escalated from verbal combat to actual bloodshed. And in the 1st century BCE, a series of civil wars tore the Republic apart, and from the ruins of those wars there emerged, in the person of Augustus Caesar, a new kind of Roman government. An empire in all but name. Breathe in and out. There is time for everything. Chapter 3. The Roman Army, the machine that built an empire. Rome did not become the dominant power of the ancient world by accident or by luck alone. It became dominant because of its army, one of the most formidable military machines in all of human history, and one whose organizational genius shaped warfare for centuries after Rome itself was gone. The fundamental unit of the Roman army was the legion, a force of roughly 5,000 heavy infantry, organized into cohorts and centuries, trained to fight as a coordinated unit rather than as a collection of individual warriors. The legionary was not primarily a brave man or a strong man, though bravery and strength were useful. He was primarily a disciplined man, trained to march long distances in heavy armor, to build fortified camps at the end of each day's march, to fight in formation, to follow orders under the stress of battle without breaking. Take a gentle breath and let your body grow heavier. The training of a Roman legionary was comprehensive and demanding. Recruits learned to march 20 miles in 5 hours, carrying equipment weighing more than 40 pounds. They learned to build field fortifications, ditch, rampart, palisade, with mechanical efficiency. They learned to use their primary weapons. The pilum, a heavy javelin designed to be thrown at close range just before hand-to-hand combat, bending on impact so that it could not be thrown back. And the gladius, a short, stabbing sword used in the press of close combat, where long swords were impractical. The genius of the Roman tactical system was its flexibility and its discipline. Roman legions could adopt different formations for different situations. They could assault fortified positions using testudo, the tortoise formation, in which soldiers locked their shields together above and around them to form an almost impenetrable shell. They could pivot and respond to threats on multiple fronts, and they rarely broke, not because Roman soldiers were individually braver than their opponents, but because the training and the unit cohesion and the institutional culture of the legion produced a collective steadiness that was almost impossible to overcome. Beyond the battlefield, the Roman army was a civilization-building institution. Roman soldiers built roads, the famous Roman roads that crossed the empire from Britain to Syria, straight as arrows, paved with stone, engineered to last for centuries. They built bridges and aqueducts and fortifications. They surveyed land and drew maps. They carried Roman culture, Latin language, Roman law, Roman religion, Roman architecture into every province they garrisoned. The army was not just a fighting force. It was the instrument through which Rome transformed the world. Roman military camps, castra, followed a standardized layout wherever they were built, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Germany. The same arrangement of streets, the same placement of the headquarters and the granary and the hospital, the same dimensions of the defensive ditch and rampart. A soldier transferred from one end of the empire to the other would find himself in a familiar camp, among familiar routines, following familiar procedures. The standardization was itself a form of power, a declaration that Rome was the same everywhere, that Roman order could be imposed on any landscape. The legions also served as a vehicle of social mobility and integration. Non-citizens who served in the auxiliary units, the supporting troops drawn from Rome's allied and subject peoples, received Roman citizenship upon discharge. Over time, the legions drew soldiers from every province of the empire, Gauls and Spaniards, Syrians and Egyptians, Britons and Pannonians, all serving together under Roman standards, all speaking Latin as their common language of command. The army was, in a very real sense, one of the most powerful forces for cultural integration the ancient world had ever seen. Great Roman commanders are among the most celebrated figures in military history. Scipio Africanus, who defeated the Carthaginian general Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, was brilliant at tactical improvisation, at turning the enemy's strengths against them. Gaius Marius, who reformed the army in the late 2nd century BCE and created the professional legionary force that would dominate the Mediterranean world, was a man of iron practicality who cared nothing for tradition and everything for results. Julius Caesar, whose Gallic campaigns between 58 and 50 BCE are among the most carefully documented military operations of the ancient world, was a commander of breathtaking speed and daring, capable of covering extraordinary distances in short times and of making decisions under pressure with a clarity that seems almost superhuman in the accounts that survive. The legions were also deeply superstitious. Before battle, the officers took the auspices, observed the behavior of sacred chickens or the flight of birds to determine whether the gods favored the engagement. Standards were sacred objects, the physical embodiment of the legion's identity and honor. To lose a standard in battle was a catastrophe, a shame that could haunt a legion for generations. When 3 legions under the general Publius Quinctilius Varus were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE by a Germanic coalition, one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, the loss of 3 legionary eagles haunted the Roman psyche so deeply that the Emperor Augustus is said to have wandered his palace at night, crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions. Breathe in and breathe out slowly." The army that built an empire and carried Roman civilization to the ends of the known world was also, in the end, one of the forces that undid the empire. As Rome's borders grew too long to be easily defended, as the cost of maintaining the legions grew too great for the treasury, as the soldiers themselves became more loyal to their commanders than to Rome itself, the institution that had been Rome's greatest strength became one of its most profound vulnerabilities. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, let the legions march, steady, disciplined, unstoppable, across the wide map of the ancient world. Chapter 4. Roman Religion, Gods, Temples, and the Sacred Calendar. The Romans were, by any measure, an intensely religious people. This may surprise those whose image of Rome is defined by its military power and its legal sophistication, but religion was woven into every aspect of Roman life, from the great state ceremonies that marked the turning of the year to the small household rituals performed every morning before breakfast. The gods were not distant or abstract. They were present in the home, in the field, in the city, in the army, and their goodwill had to be continuously cultivated through the correct performance of the correct rites. The Roman religious system was polytheistic, a world of many gods, each with their own domain, their own personality, their own cult and priesthood and festival calendar. The Romans inherited much of their mythology from the Greeks, identifying their own gods with Greek equivalents, Jupiter with Zeus, Mars with Ares, Venus with Aphrodite, Mercury with Hermes, Neptune with Poseidon, Minerva with Athena. Take a slow breath. Let your mind drift gently. At the head of the Roman pantheon stood Jupiter, the king of the gods, the lord of sky and thunder, the guardian of Rome's destiny. His great temple on the Capitoline Hill, the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, was the most important religious site in the city. It was here that Roman generals came to make their vows before departing for war, and here that they returned in triumph to give thanks for victory. Mars, the god of war, held a special place in Roman religion because of his role in the city's founding mythology. As the father of Romulus and Remus, he was the divine ancestor of Rome itself. His great altar, the Ara Martis in the Campus Martius, The Field of Mars, the flat plain outside the city walls where the army trained and the people voted, was one of the oldest and most sacred sites in Rome. Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and the home, was perhaps the most universally venerated deity in Rome. Every Roman household had its own small hearth shrine to Vesta, where the family's sacred fire was kept burning. In the Roman Forum, the public hearth of the entire city, the Temple of Vesta, a round building symbolic of the round hut of Rome's earliest ancestors, housed the sacred fire that represented the life of Rome itself. If the fire went out, it was a terrible omen, and it could only be relit by the friction of wood rubbing on wood. Primitive, ancient, connecting the Rome of the Forum to the Rome of the shepherd villages on the 7 hills. The fire of Vesta was tended by the Vestal Virgins, 6 priestesses chosen between the ages of 6 and 10 from the best families of Rome, who served for 30 years, and during that time were bound by a vow of chastity. The Vestals were among the most important and most privileged people in Rome. They had their own house beside the Temple of Vesta, with extensive gardens and personal staff. They had the right to free any condemned prisoner they encountered on the street. The Roman religious calendar was a dense weave of festivals, each one requiring specific ceremonies, processions, sacrifices, and often games or theatrical performances. The Lupercalia in February was one of the oldest and strangest. Priests called Luperci ran nearly naked through the streets of the city. Striking women they met with strips of goat skin, a ritual believed to promote fertility. The Saturnalia in December was a week-long festival of role reversal, in which masters served their slaves at dinner, gifts were exchanged, and the usual social hierarchies were symbolically suspended, a reminder, perhaps, of an older and more equal world. The Romans also had a very practical, transactional approach to their religion. The relationship between a Roman and their gods was essentially contractual. Duat des, I give so that you might give. You performed the sacrifice. You said the correct prayers in the correct words. You offered the correct gifts at the correct time. And in return, the gods were obligated to provide what you had asked for. This pragmatic religiosity extended to Rome's treatment of foreign gods. When Rome conquered a new people, it did not generally try to suppress their religion. Instead, it absorbed it. Foreign gods were invited, through a ritual called evocatio, to come and live in Rome, where they would be honored and where they might add their power to Rome's own divine arsenal. The result was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan religious landscape. Rome at its height was a city full of temples to gods from every corner of the empire. Isis and Mithras, and Cybele and Serapis, all finding homes in the capital of a civilization that was, at its most expansive, genuinely open to the divine in all its forms. Breathe in, hold it gently, and let it go. Let the smoke of incense drift through your imagination now, the sweet, heavy smell of offerings burning on marble altars, the sound of priests chanting in Latin, the cool shadow of a temple's interior where the golden face of a god looks down with serene, unchanging calm. Rome is full of gods tonight, as it always was. Chapter 5. Daily Life in Rome. Markets, baths, and the streets of the Eternal City. The Rome of emperors and generals and great events is only one Rome. There is another Rome, just as real and perhaps more vivid. The Rome of ordinary days, of shopping and cooking and washing and arguing and laughing and loving and simply being alive in a very large, very crowded, very noisy city that was, for several centuries, the largest city in the Western world. At its height, in the 2nd century CE, the city of Rome had a population of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, a number that would not be matched by any Western European city until London in the 18th century. These people lived crowded together in a city that was, by modern standards, remarkably compact. Its population, density comparable to the most crowded neighborhoods of modern-day Mumbai or Manhattan. Take a breath and let your shoulders drop. Most Romans lived in apartment buildings called insula. The Latin word means islands, and the buildings rose like islands from the sea of streets around them, sometimes to 6 or 7 stories. The ground floor was typically occupied by shops, with the shopkeeper's family living in the back. Upper floors were divided into rented apartments of varying sizes. The street life of Rome was intense and unceasing. Roman law prohibited wheeled vehicles from the city streets during daylight hours. The traffic congestion was simply too great. So the goods that kept the city fed and clothed and supplied arrived by night in carts and wagons that rumbled over the cobblestones in the dark hours. During the day, the streets were full of pedestrians, shoppers and tradespeople, students and teachers, politicians and their clients, street vendors selling hot food from portable braziers, water carriers, letter carriers, slaves on errands for their masters. The Roman baths, the thermae, were one of the great institutions of Roman civilization, and one of the things Romans of all classes genuinely had in common. The great imperial baths, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Trajan, were enormous complexes that could accommodate thousands of bathers simultaneously. They were not merely places to wash. They were social centers, recreation complexes, the ancient world's equivalent of a gym, a spa, a library, and a community center all in one. A visit to the baths followed a standard sequence. You began in the apoditerium, the changing room. Then you moved through the sequence of heated rooms, the tepidarium, warm, the caldarium, hot and steamy, where you sweated and were scraped clean with a curved metal tool called a strigile, and finally the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool, which closed the pores and left you feeling clean and invigorated. The Romans ate 3 meals a day, though the first 2 were usually light and quick. The main meal was the cena, dinner, eaten in the late afternoon or evening. For the wealthy, dinner could be an elaborate social occasion with multiple courses, fine wine, reclining couches called triclinia, and entertainment. For the poor, dinner was more likely to be a bowl of porridge made from spelt wheat, or a piece of bread dipped in olive oil, or a serving of lentil soup bought from a thermopolium, a Roman fast food restaurant, essentially, with large clay pots sunk into the counter and kept warm, from which customers could buy hot food to take away or eat on the spot. Roman children played with toys that would be recognizable to any child today. Dolls with jointed limbs, miniature carts and animals, hoops to roll, balls to throw. They went to school, where a magister taught them to read and write Latin and Greek, to calculate, and to recite the great works of Roman literature. Literacy was widespread by ancient standards, as testified by the extraordinary quantity of graffiti that survives, on the walls of Pompeii especially, recording the thoughts and opinions and jokes and declarations of love of ordinary Romans. Breathe in gently and out. Close your eyes and hear it now, the distant sound of Rome going about its business in the warm Italian night. The carts on the cobblestones, the bark of a dog, the last notes of a musician playing somewhere at the dark, the city breathing, enormous and alive, around the small, warm fact of you, lying still, growing sleepier. Chapter 6. Julius Caesar, the man who changed everything. Of all the figures who walked the streets of ancient Rome, none is more famous, more studied, more argued about, or more endlessly fascinating than Gaius Julius Caesar. He was a general of genius, a politician of extraordinary skill, a writer of elegant clarity, a man of personal charisma so powerful that it was felt even by those who feared and hated him. And in the end, he was the figure whose life and death broke the Republic and made the empire inevitable. Caesar was born in 100 BCE into a patrician family of old lineage, but modest means. Rome in his youth was already in the grip of the tensions that would ultimately destroy the Republic. The gap between rich and poor had grown vast. The old aristocratic families were threatened by new men who had risen through military command, and the Italian allies had recently fought a bitter war to win Roman citizenship. Take a slow breath. In and out. He was educated in the finest tradition of Roman aristocratic culture, rhetoric, philosophy, Greek literature. As a young man, he was captured by pirates while crossing the Aegean Sea, and he responded to his captivity with a characteristic mixture of charm and imperious confidence. He laughed at the ransom the pirates demanded, telling them it was far too low for a man of his importance, and he promised them, cheerfully, that he would return and crucify them all. After his ransom was paid and he was released, he did exactly that. His political career was calculated and relentless. He allied himself with the popular faction, the populares, who claimed to represent the interests of the common people, and used that alliance, along with his personal charm and his willingness to spend enormous sums of money on public entertainments and largesse, to build a political base that cut across class lines. In Gaul, Caesar fought for 8 years and transformed himself from a prominent politician into a legend. He conquered the whole of Gaul, bringing it permanently under Roman control. He crossed the Rhine twice, demonstrating Roman power to the Germanic tribes beyond. He led 2 expeditions to Britain, the first Roman commander to reach that misty island at the edge of the known world. He fought dozens of engagements, built siege works of extraordinary sophistication, and wrote about all of it in the Commentari de Bello Gallico, his account of the Gallic Wars, written in the third person, in spare and elegant Latin prose that has been used to teach the language to students ever since. When his command in Gaul ended, his enemies in Rome moved to bring him to trial. Caesar refused to disband his army and submit. he crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper, which a Roman general was forbidden by law to cross with his army, in January 49 BCE. It was an act of revolution. There was no going back. The phrase crossing the Rubicon has entered human language as an expression for any point of no return, any irrevocable commitment. Civil war followed. Caesar moved with his characteristic speed, and within months he controlled Italy. Within 3 years, after campaigns in Spain, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and North Africa, he controlled the entire Roman world. He reformed the calendar, the Julian calendar that, with minor modifications by Pope Gregory XIII, is the calendar we still use today. And then, on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BCE, a group of senators who called themselves the Liberatores stabbed him 23 times in the Senate House. He fell at the base of a statue of his old rival Pompey, and the republic he had helped destroy died with him. Breathe in, and let that moment pass into history. His last words, according to some accounts, were addressed to his friend Marcus Junius Brutus, one of the conspirators. And you too, child, et tu, Brute? Whether he actually said this, no one can know. But Shakespeare heard the story 2,000 years later and gave the words to one of his greatest characters, and the phrase has echoed through the centuries ever since. Chapter 7. Augustus, the first emperor and the Golden Age. Caesar's death did not save the Republic. It only prolonged the agony of its dying. 13 more years of civil war followed, until a young man named Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, who would eventually be known as Augustus, defeated all his rivals and stood alone as the master of the Roman world. Augustus was 23 years old when Caesar was assassinated. He was slight, not particularly healthy, and had no particular military reputation. His great-uncle's political allies assumed he could be managed or marginalized. They were wrong. With a combination of political intelligence, patience, tactical ruthlessness, and an instinctive understanding of what Romans needed to believe about themselves and their city, Octavian outmaneuvered and ultimately destroyed every rival he faced. Take a breath. Feel the quiet settling around you. What he did with that power was one of the most remarkable political achievements in human history. He did not make himself king. Romans hated kings, and the memory of Caesar's assassination was fresh. Instead, he constructed an elaborate fiction. He was simply the leading citizen, the princeps, the first among equals. He held power not as a tyrant, but through the accumulation of traditional republican offices and titles. In practice, he was a monarch. In theory, the republic continued. Most Romans, exhausted by generations of civil war, were happy to accept the fiction. They wanted peace. They wanted stability. They wanted the markets to be safe, the roads to be maintained, the borders to hold. Augustus gave them all of this, and much more. The reign of Augustus, from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a span of 41 years, is known as the Augustan Age, and it is one of the most celebrated periods in the history of art and literature. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, Horace wrote his odes, lyric poems of extraordinary craft and beauty, celebrating friendship, wine, love, the Italian countryside, and the gift of the present moment. Ovid wrote the Metamorphoses. Livy wrote his monumental history of Rome. Augustus also transformed the physical city of Rome. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He built or restored 82 temples. He constructed the Forum of Augustus, with its great temple of Mars, Ultor, Mars the Avenger. He built the Ara Pacis, the Altar of Peace, a beautifully carved marble monument, celebrating the peace he had brought to the Roman world after a century of conflict. The system he built, the Principate, the constitutional monarchy disguised as a republic, was durable enough to outlast him and his immediate successors by centuries. The Roman Empire that he founded would last in the west until 476 CE, and in the east, in the form of the Byzantine Empire, until 1453 CE, 1,500 years. Not bad for a fiction. Breathe in and out. Let the golden afternoon light of the Augustan age settle over you. Chapter 8. Roman engineering, roads, aqueducts, and the architecture of power. If Roman religion was the soul of the civilization and Roman law its mind, then Roman engineering was its body, the physical expression of a culture that believed, with deep conviction, that the world could be shaped to human will. The Romans were not the most original engineers in the ancient world. They borrowed freely from the Greeks and the Etruscans and the peoples they conquered, but they were perhaps the most systematic, the most ambitious, and the most consequential engineers in history. The Roman road network was the circulatory system of the empire. At its greatest extent, it covered more than 75,000 miles, enough to circle the earth 3 times. The roads were not merely dirt tracks or improved paths. They were engineered structures built to last, designed for all-weather use by armies, merchants, postal riders, and the streams of ordinary travelers who moved constantly through the empire. Take a slow breath and let your body grow heavy and still. The Roman aqueducts were perhaps even more impressive. The city of Rome at its height consumed an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day. This water arrived through 11 major aqueducts, built and extended over 5 centuries, that drew water from sources in the hills surrounding the city and carried it, by gravity alone, along channels that maintained an almost impossibly precise downward gradient over distances of tens of miles. Where the aqueducts had to cross valleys, they were carried on arched bridges. The great aqueduct bridges that are among the most beautiful surviving structures of the ancient world. The Pont du Gard in southern France, built in the 1st century CE to carry the Nîmes aqueduct across the Gardon River, rises in 3 tiers of arches to a height of 49 meters. It is still standing. It has been standing for nearly 2,000 years. Built without mortar, its massive stone blocks held in place by nothing but the precision of their cutting and the geometry of the arch. The arch was the key to Roman architectural achievement. The Romans did not invent the arch, but they mastered it and deployed it at a scale and with a confidence that no previous culture had approached. The arch transfers the weight of the structure above it outward and downward through its curved form, allowing much larger spans than are possible with post and lintel construction. The Pantheon in Rome, built in its current form under the Emperor Hadrian around 125 CE, is the supreme expression of this achievement. Its concrete dome, spanning 43 meters and open to the sky at its center through a circular oculus 9 meters across, was the largest dome in the world for 1,300 years. It remains one of the best preserved buildings from the ancient world, still in use today as a church, still drawing visitors from around the globe who walk in through the bronze doors and look up at that perfect hemisphere of concrete and feel, almost invariably, something close to awe. The Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, built between 70 and 80 CE, is the most famous surviving Roman building, and with good reason. It seated roughly 50,000 spectators who could enter and exit through 76 numbered arches in a matter of minutes. Beneath the wooden arena floor lay a complex network of underground passages and chambers where animals and gladiators waited before their appearance, where elevators and trapdoors allowed spectacular surprise entrances. Breathe in and out. Feel the weight of all that stone resting quietly in your mind. There is something deeply restful about permanence. The Pantheon is still there. The Pont du Gard is still there. The roads are still there, under the tarmac and the cobblestones, running straight and confident through the landscape that Rome once claimed, and that still, in some sense, bears its mark. Chapter 9. Roman Philosophy, Stoics, Epicureans, and the Search for Peace. The Romans were not, on the whole, original philosophers. They freely admitted this. Roman thinkers saw themselves as the pupils and transmitters of Greek philosophy rather than its creators, and they were somewhat self-deprecating about it. But what the Romans did with Greek philosophy, the way they adapted it, simplified it, applied it to the practical business of living a human life in a complicated world, produced some of the most readable and personally useful philosophical writing in any language. Two philosophical schools dominated Roman intellectual life: Stoicism and Epicureanism. They approached the fundamental questions of the good life from different directions, but they shared a common concern. How do you live well in a world you cannot control, in a body that will die, in a city of 2 million people, most of whom are not your friends? Take a breath. Just a gentle breath. In and out. Stoicism was founded by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, and it found its greatest expression in Rome in the writings of Seneca, the letters of Marcus Aurelius, and the lectures of Epictetus. At its core, Stoicism teaches a simple but demanding distinction. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. The external world, what happens to us, what other people do, whether we succeed or fail, whether we are healthy or sick, wealthy or poor, is not ultimately up to us. What is up to us is our response, our judgments, our choices, our attitudes, the will we bring to our circumstances. The Stoic goal was ataraxia, tranquility, equanimity, the peace that comes from accepting what you cannot change and directing your energy toward what you can. This did not mean passive resignation. The Stoics were, in general, deeply engaged with the world. Seneca was an advisor to emperors. Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign on the battlefield. But they engaged with it without being controlled by it. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the most remarkable of the Roman Stoics, because we have his private philosophical journal, the Meditations, written not for publication, but for his own use during his campaigns on the Danube frontier as a kind of daily practice of philosophical self-examination. The man who wrote those meditations was the most powerful person in the world. Emperor of Rome, commander of its armies, master of its treasury. And what he wrote in the small hours of the night in his military tent was this: you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Epictetus was the other great Roman Stoic, and his life was as remarkable as his philosophy. He was a slave, born into slavery, owned by a freedman of the Emperor Nero, later freed himself and permitted to teach philosophy. The central insight of his Enchiridion is that freedom is not a matter of legal status. A slave who has mastered his own judgments and desires is freer than a king who is enslaved to his fears and appetites. Epicureanism, named for its Greek founder Epicurus, is often misunderstood as a philosophy of sensual pleasure. Eat, drink, and be merry. In fact, Epicurus taught something much more subtle and, in practice, rather austere. The goal of life, he said, is pleasure, but pleasure properly understood, which means not the intense, transient pleasures of luxury and excess, but the quiet, steady pleasure of a life free from pain and anxiety. The greatest pleasures are simple: bread and water, the company of friends, philosophical conversation, the contemplation of the natural world. Breathe in slowly and let the breath go. The present moment is enough. Let their words rest in you now, calm and clear and old. What is not in your control is not your burden. The simple pleasures, warmth, quiet, the comfort of a bed, are the real ones. You have everything you need, right here, right now. Sleep is coming, and sleep is good. Chapter 10. Pompeii, the city frozen in time. On the 24th of August, 79 CE, or possibly in October, based on recent archaeological evidence, the volcano Vesuvius erupted with a violence that has rarely been equaled in recorded history. The eruption sent a column of ash and rock nearly 30 kilometers into the sky. It produced pyroclastic surges, superheated flows of gas and volcanic debris moving at hurricane speed that swept down the flanks of the mountain and across the surrounding countryside. And it buried, under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, several towns and villas in the Bay of Naples, among them the city of Pompeii. Approximately 2,000 people died in Pompeii, a fraction of its total population of perhaps 11,000, most of whom had time to flee when the eruption began. Those who died were mostly people who delayed too long, or who returned for valuables, or who sheltered in buildings that collapsed under the weight of the ash. Breathe gently, in and out. What Vesuvius took from those people, it gave to the rest of humanity, in the form of the most extraordinarily well-preserved ancient city in the world. The ash and pumice that buried Pompeii also protected it from the weathering and looting and repurposing that destroyed so much of the ancient world. For nearly 1,700 years, the city lay beneath its volcanic blanket, unknown and untouched. And then, in the 18th century, excavations began, and the buried city began to emerge. What the excavations revealed was astonishing. Streets still paved with the original stone, the ruts of wagon wheels still visible in the surface, houses with their walls still standing, their painted plaster still showing vivid scenes of mythology and daily life, their floors still covered with intricate mosaics, shops with their marble counters intact, a bakery with loaves of bread still in the oven, turned to carbon, but recognizably loaves of bread. And the people. The most haunting discovery of Pompeii is its people, or rather, the voids left by their bodies. When the volcanic ash hardened around the corpses of those who died in the eruption, it formed a perfect mold. As the bodies decomposed over the centuries, the mold remained empty, preserving the exact shape of each person at the moment of their death. When archaeologists discovered these voids, they filled them with plaster, and the result was a series of eerily lifelike casts of the dead. But Pompeii is not only a monument to death. It is a monument to life, to the specific, vivid, surprising life of a prosperous Roman town in the 1st century of the Common Era. The graffiti on the walls of Pompeii alone could fill several books. There are political slogans, support for candidates in the upcoming local elections. There are announcements of gladiatorial shows. There are declarations of love. One inscription reads, "The man I'm in love with told me I'm not pretty. But let him stop being so pretty himself, and we'll see." Pompeii makes the ancient world concrete in a way that no written source can quite match. It is not an abstraction. It is a place. It has streets you can walk and houses you can enter and walls you can read. It puts you in direct contact with people who lived 2,000 years ago, whose handwriting is still on the walls, whose footprints are still in the stone. Take a slow breath and feel the passage of time gently in your chest. Chapter 11. Christianity's rise in Rome. A new faith in the eternal city. Rome's relationship with Christianity is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of history. A story of persecution and accommodation, of conversion and transformation, of a small religious movement, born in a remote province of the empire, growing over 3 centuries into the official religion of the empire itself. Christianity entered the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, carried initially by Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean world. The new faith spread along the Roman road network through the port cities of the eastern Mediterranean into the Jewish diaspora communities of Alexandria and Antioch and Rome itself. Breathe in and out. Let the centuries pass quietly. The Roman state's initial attitude toward Christianity was suspicious, but not systematically hostile. The Romans tolerated an enormous variety of religious practices, but Christians created problems. They refused to worship the Roman gods, a refusal that Romans interpreted as impiety. They refused to participate in the imperial cult, and they met in private, in people's homes, with a secretiveness that invited suspicion. The Emperor Nero, in 64 CE, blamed the Christians for a great fire that had devastated much of Rome, a charge almost certainly false, but politically convenient, and launched the first systematic persecution. The apostles Peter and Paul are traditionally said to have been martyred in Rome during this persecution. The deaths of the martyrs, far from destroying the movement, gave it a new power. The willingness to die, rather than renounce the faith, became itself a form of testimony. The turning point came in 312 CE at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The Emperor Constantine saw, or claimed to have seen, a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky, with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. He had the symbol painted on his soldiers' shields, won the battle, and attributed his victory to the Christian god. The following year, the Edict of Milan formally granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. By the end of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity was not merely tolerated, but mandatory, the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The gods of Rome, Jupiter and Mars and Venus and Vesta, the divine presences that had inhabited the city's temples for 1,000 years, were declared false, their cults dismantled. It was a transformation of extraordinary speed and completeness. In less than 3 centuries, a small religious movement born in a province of the empire had become the religion of the empire itself. The roads Rome had built to move its legions and its merchants became the roads along which Christianity traveled. The Latin language Rome had spread across the Western Empire became the language of the Christian Church. Breathe slowly, in and out. Chapter 12. Roman Women, Family, and the Private World. We have spent much of our journey in the public world of Rome, the Forum, the Senate, the battlefield, the temple. But Rome was also a private world, a world of homes and families and relationships, and that world was shaped profoundly by the roles assigned to and claimed by Roman women. The Roman family, the familia, was organized around the figure of the paterfamilias, the father of the family, who held in theory absolute legal authority over everyone in his household. His wife, his children, his slaves, his freedmen, and any dependents under his protection. This authority, the patria potestas, was remarkably broad. In practice, these extreme powers were rarely exercised, and they were progressively curtailed by law and custom over the centuries. Take a breath. Let your body sink a little deeper. Within this framework, Roman women occupied a complex and sometimes surprising position. They could not vote or hold public office. But over time, Roman women acquired increasing legal independence. By the late Republic and early Empire, women of the upper classes could own property, manage businesses, make wills, and in practice, exercise very significant economic and social power. The women of the imperial family, the empresses and mothers and sisters of emperors, could wield influence that was, by any realistic assessment, enormous. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was his political partner and trusted advisor for 50 years. Agrippina the Younger, mother of the Emperor Nero, was one of the most powerful political figures of the 1st century CE. She was present at Senate meetings, conducted her own diplomacy. Ordinary Roman women lived lives shaped by the rhythms of the household. The management of the household was recognized as a skilled and responsible occupation. A Roman matron who ran her household well, managed its slaves and resources efficiently, raised her children properly, and maintained the family's social relationships was fulfilling a role that was publicly honored. In practice, many Roman women did far more than spin and weave. We have evidence of women running businesses, acting as money-lenders and landlords, managing agricultural estates. The family altar, the Lararium, stood in the atrium of the Roman home, a small shrine to the Lares, the household gods, and to the Penates, the gods of the store cupboard. Every morning, before the household began the day's business, offerings were made at the Lararium, a small portion of food, a pinch of incense, a few drops of wine. The woman of the household was often responsible for maintaining this daily ritual. Breathe in and out. Let the image of the Roman home settle around you. Let the image of the Roman home settle around you now. The cool stone floor, the small flame burning at the Lararium, the sound of water in the impluvium, the smell of bread baking somewhere at the back of the house. It is evening. The household is winding down. The city hums outside the walls, vast and alive, but in here it is quiet. In here it is home. Chapter 13. The Fall of Rome. How an Empire Ends. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West is one of the great historical questions, studied, debated, and argued about for centuries by historians who have proposed dozens of different explanations, from economic collapse to military overextension to climate change, to the rise of Christianity to simple bad luck. What is clear is that the Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It declined over a period of roughly 3 centuries, from the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly disintegrated under the pressure of external invasions, internal usurpations, economic disruption, and plague, to the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer in 476 CE. Take a slow breath and let the centuries drift past. The pressures on the empire were real and severe. The borders were simply too long to defend with the resources available. The Rhine and Danube frontiers in the north required enormous standing armies to hold. The cost of these armies strained the treasury. The currency was debased to pay the soldiers, causing inflation. Trade disrupted, tax revenues fell, the armies demanded higher pay, a spiral not easily broken. The Germanic peoples who pressed against Rome's northern borders were not, for the most part, mindless destroyers. Many of them had been in contact with Roman civilization for centuries. Many served in the Roman army, rising to high command. They admired Rome, wore Roman clothes, spoke Latin, converted to Christianity. When they crossed the borders in force, many of them were trying to be part of Roman civilization, not destroy it. The Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410 CE under their king Alaric, the first time Rome had been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years, were Christian, spoke Latin, and had been trying for years to negotiate a settlement with the empire. The sack lasted 3 days and was, by ancient standards, relatively restrained. Did Rome fall, or did it transform? The question is genuinely open. The Germanic kingdoms that succeeded the Western Empire were not barbarian negations of Roman civilization, but awkward, imperfect continuations of it. Their kings used Roman law. Their bishops presided over a church that spoke Latin. The Middle Ages were not a repudiation of Rome, but a slow, difficult, partial recovery of it. And Rome itself, the city, continued. It shrank dramatically, but people lived there. The Forum is there, its ruins warm in the Italian sun. The Pantheon is still there. Rome didn't fall, it changed, and it is still changing, as all living things do, carrying its past with it into a future that it has been building for 2,700 years. Breathe in and breathe out slowly. Chapter 14. Rome's enduring legacy, the world Rome made. We live in Rome, not literally. Most of us are not in Italy, and even those who are do not live in the Rome of the emperors. But the world we inhabit, its legal systems, its languages, its calendar, its architecture, its religious institutions, its political ideas, is in large part a product of Rome, filtered through the centuries of European history that followed the empire's transformation, but never ceased to carry its imprint. The legal legacy of Rome is perhaps the most profound and most pervasive. Roman law, developed over centuries from the 12 tables of the 5th century BCE to the great codification under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE, is the foundation of the legal systems of most of Europe, Latin America, and much of the world beyond. Take a gentle breath and rest. The Latin language gave rise to the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, which are spoken today by nearly 1 billion people as their first language. It also contributed enormously to English. When you say century or republic or senate or justice or city or public or private or legal or final or perfect or general, you are using Latin. The language of Rome is in your mouth right now. The calendar we used, the Gregorian calendar, is a direct descendant of the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, reformed slightly by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. The months of the year are named for Roman gods and Roman emperors. January for Janus, the god of beginnings. March for Mars, the god of war. July for Julius Caesar. August for Augustus. The architecture of the Western world is saturated with Rome. The dome, the arch, the colonnade, the basilica floor plan, all Roman inventions or Roman developments of earlier forms, recur throughout European and American architecture, from the Renaissance to the present day. The United States Capitol building, with its great dome and its columned portico, is a direct descendant of Roman architecture. The political vocabulary of the modern world is Roman. Republic, Senate, Constitution, citizen, civil, civilian, magistrate, dictator, emperor. All of these words carry their Roman origins with them. The American founding fathers were deeply conscious of this heritage. They read Cicero and Plutarch and Livy. They argued about the lessons of the Roman Republic. They named one of their legislative bodies the Senate. To study Rome is to study ourselves. Not because we are Romans. We are not, and the differences between the ancient world and our own are as profound as the similarities. But because the world we inhabit was shaped, more than any other single force, by the civilization that grew from a small village on 7 hills beside a slow river in central Italy and expanded over 8 centuries to fill the entire known world. Breathe in, slowly, and out. Chapter 15. The Long Afterlife of Rome. And then there is the idea of Rome itself, the idea that a city, a civilization, a set of shared values and institutions can be greater than any individual who participates in it, can outlast any particular generation, can be something worth building and preserving and passing on. This idea, the idea of the common good, the res publica, the public thing, is perhaps Rome's most essential gift. The Renaissance was, in large part, a rediscovery of Rome. The great humanist scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries read Cicero and Virgil and Livy with the excitement of people discovering a lost world that was, somehow, also their own. They imitated Roman literary forms, adapted Roman architectural models, revived Roman educational ideals. They believed, with a passionate conviction, that the wisdom of Rome was the foundation on which a better world could be built. Take a breath, slow and deep. They were not wrong. The American founding fathers, reading those same texts in the 18th century, drew directly on Roman precedents as they designed their republic. The French revolutionaries took Roman names and Roman symbols as they built their new order. The architects of the United Nations drew on Roman concepts of international law as they designed the institutions of the post-war world. We are very far from Rome in time, but we are not far from it in the questions that matter most. And on a quiet night, with the day's noise faded and the mind growing still, it is possible to feel the connection across all those centuries, the unbroken thread of human curiosity and human effort that runs from the shepherds on the 7 hills to the senators in their togas, to the scholars of the Renaissance, to the people of today. All of us participants in a conversation that has been going on for 2,500 years and shows no sign of ending. And so our journey through ancient Rome comes gently to its end. We have walked a long way tonight, through the mythological mists of the city's founding, through the measured debates of the Senate, across the paved roads of the legions, into the steam of the great baths and the noise of the morning market. We have stood in the shadow of the Pantheon and the Colosseum. We have listened to the Stoics' counsel, patience, and the Epicureans' counsel, simplicity. We have watched Rome rise to its impossible height, and then, slowly and incompletely, transform into the world that came after it. Take a long, slow breath, in and out. Rome is not finished. It is still here, in the laws that govern us, and the languages we speak, and the calendar we follow, and the buildings we live and work in. It is in the idea that citizens have rights that even governments must respect. It is in the conviction that the law should apply equally to everyone. It is also here, tonight, in the simple fact that we are telling stories about it. That 2,000 years later, in a world that Caesar and Augustus would find almost unrecognizable, People are still curious about those lives, still finding in them something relevant and human, still reaching back through the centuries to touch something that feels, in its essential humanity, familiar. Breathe in, gently, and out. We are all, in some sense, the inheritors of Rome. Not the Rome of conquest and slavery and the Colosseum. Not that Rome, which had deep and terrible flaws, as all human institutions do. But the Rome of Cicero arguing for justice in the courts, and Marcus Aurelius writing in his tent by lamplight about how to be a better person, and the ordinary citizens of Pompeii writing their names and their jokes and their declarations of love on the walls of their city before the mountain took them. That Rome, human, flawed, reaching, aspiring, alive, is in us too. This has been Nap Time Knowledge. Thank you for traveling through the ancient world with me tonight. Let your body sink deeply into the warmth and stillness of sleep. Let your mind release the great span of history it has been holding and rest in the simple present. The breath moving in and out, the weight of your body against the surface beneath you, the darkness that is ordinary and comfortable and kind. Breathe in and out. The Tiber is still flowing tonight, through the city that was and the city that is, carrying its quiet water toward the sea. The 7 hills are still there, patient under the centuries of stone and marble and concrete that have accumulated on their slopes. The she-wolf is still watching from wherever she watches, keeping her ancient and fierce vigil over the children she raised against all probability. Breathe in and let it go. Rome is eternal, after all. Not in the way the emperors meant it, not as a political power that would last forever, but in the way that all great stories are eternal. As long as there are people to tell them and people to listen, they do not die. They simply wait in the dark for the next voice to pick them up. Good night. Breathe in slowly and out. The she-wolf is watching. The Tiber is flowing. The 7 hills are patient. Sleep well.